Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Feudernick, and this podcast is about defusing the culture wars by having civil, respectful dialogue around school-related issues that are often complex and controversial. If you're new to the show and saw the topic we are focused on today, you might be expecting, even hoping for, kind of a raucous debate, maybe even some yellings and put downs, the kind of things we see on mainstream media sometimes. But I think the best you can say about those kinds of exchanges is that they're entertaining, but they don't really lead to any resolutions or compromises or clearer understandings. And they tend to just contribute to the polarization that I think is really killing our country and hurting our schools. So that's why we're not going to do that today. The topic, and yes, it is complex and controversial, is on homeschooling, whether it's a good idea and whether it should be regulated. In other words, should parents, taxpayers, be allowed to do whatever they please with their students, or whether the government should require parents to follow some sort of guidelines if they want their students or children to be homeschooled. So let's start by meeting our guest, and then I'll provide a little bit of background about homeschooling, and then we'll get into it and allow our guests to share their perspectives on this interesting topic. So, Weston, let's begin with you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Ken. I'm excited to be here. Like you said, my name is Weston Brown. I'm here today to kind of share perspective on what it's like to be homeschooled. I was homeschooled from pre-K all the way through high school. I grew up in Dallas, and I now live in San Diego, California. And I'm really excited to meet the rest of the guests and be part of the show.
Great, terrific. Samantha, introduce yourself, your first and last name, and tell us a little bit about where you live and your connection to this topic.
My name is Samantha Field. I'm the Government Relations Director at the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, which is the only organization that advocates for the well-being and success of homeschooled students. And I currently live in Michigan.
Great to have you with us today, Samantha. Heidi, I'm going to come to you next.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm actually Representative Heidi Sampson, so that kind of gives a clue of what I'm doing. I live in Alfred, Maine, and I'm just glad to be able to contribute to this conversation.
And I have in my notes that you are on the Education and Cultural Affairs Committee, and you are a veteran homeschooler yourself. Is that right?
Yeah, 30 years veteran homeschooler, and now I'm in my last term serving a total of 8 years in the state legislature and have served as a ranking member on the Education Committee.
And are you completing your time in the legislature because of term limits?
Correct. We have 8 years and that's it.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us, Heidi. And Nicole, tell us a little bit about you.
Hi, my name is Nicole Doyle, and I'm from Stonecrest, Georgia. I am a homeschooling mom of 4. I have 2 homeschool graduates who are a college senior and a college sophomore. I am currently serving as the board chair for DeKalb Christian Home Educators, and I am the co-collaborator of the Georgia Black Home Educators Network here in Georgia.
Fantastic. We're going to come back to all of you in just a few minutes. I just want to provide a little bit of factual background about the topic we're discussing today. About 50 years ago, homeschooling was quite rare and not well regulated by education experts and government officials. Only about 10 to 20,000 children learned this way, since only 3 states permitted homeschooling. In the 1980s, homeschooling became more popular among liberals and conservatives, and during that era, all 50 states would adopt laws permitting some forms of homeschooling. By the beginning of this century, over 1 million youth were being homeschooled, and by 2020-21, just before COVID, a survey showed that about 5% of the nation's students were being homeschooled. That number more than doubled several months later when COVID hit. Just one more piece of information. Among the world's industrialized nations, the United States is the least restrictive when it comes to homeschooling. About 9 states have virtually no restrictions, but countries like Japan, Sweden, Germany, according to a report from a journal that I will post on our website all but prohibit the practice, and many other European countries impose tight restrictions on it, such as requiring parents to hold educator certification or mandating that students take exams to demonstrate academic progress. Okay, so let's get back to our guests, and I want to have each of you, before we have you share an opinion about, whether homeschooling is a good idea and whether it should be regulated, and if so, how. I just want you to take a couple of minutes each to talk about your own experience with either being homeschooled or being a homeschooling parent, and what that is like, that's been like for you. So I think I'll go back and start with you, Heidi. You've been a homeschooling mom, I think you said, for 30 years. Is that right?
30 years ago. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I got into it in an unusual way, and a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their brain around this. But I was very involved. I had a little boy. He was in second grade. I was always around helping in the schools. I developed wellness programs in the school and in the district, and I was just always around. And it was the principal of the school that pulled me into his office one day at the beginning of his third grade year and said, Heidi, you need to homeschool him. And that rocked my world. I had a business. I had this, fitness foundation. It was starting to go national with programs that I had piloted in the school. And I could not wrap my brain around that. I used to be very vocal about the fact that I'll never homeschool. Why would I hide from the world, stick my head in the ground, and my kids not be exposed to anything? And so when my husband and I decided this is what we need to do for this little guy, he needed time, he needed to be home. And I just, I thought, well, I went to good schools and everything. Yeah, I've got this, no problem. Well, that was like the furthest thing from reality. And after a year of basically just duplicating the public school system, which was failing for him, I called the principal up. It was in the middle of the winter. And I said, I don't want to do this anymore. You can have him back. And he said, no, he needs to be home with you. Heidi, learning happens many ways. And that was a switch that got me thinking, wait a minute, I'm not thinking about this the right way. And I'm thinking about, just going through the rote process. And when he said learning happens many ways, I thought, my background was research. And I thought, what? I don't know anything about learning. I was a science person. I worked with scientists and I knew nothing about this. So I started researching education in America to the bedrock. And I studied all the different types throughout the world, different types of teaching environments that were going to foster a healthy learning environment. And I pulled together, it would have been a PhD thesis, the amount of stuff that I did. And so I started to develop a philosophy of education for my child and then all the ones that came after me. And I was also very involved with a homeschooling group, because at that time in the state of Maine, you had to have a support group if you were going to homeschool. And so we started this group. We had like 150 families. Now keep in mind, this is right in 1990. Homeschooling was not a big thing then, but it started to become a really big thing in Maine. And so I went, once I started learning how to create a healthy learning environment, I started teaching the fellow homeschoolers, and then I ended up going to Canada, going to South America, going around the country, speaking about that. Well, I became, after I graduated my last child, I got this phone call out of the dark from the governor of the state of Maine asking if I would consider being on the State Board of Education as the first homeschooler to ever be appointed to any state board in the country. I thought he was crazy. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I was out of the system. I didn't want to be part of it. But I started to realize after they really started twisting my arm, I was not an easy sell. I was going to bring something to the table that was different. And I served on the State Board of Education it was an appointed position for 5 years. And at which time I realized, the legislature needs people that actually look under the hood and really examine education policy. And so I ran for the state legislature, and I've been serving on the education committee for the last 7 years.
Thank you, Heidi. One question that comes to mind when the principal came and said your son, I believe it was, needs to be homeschooled. Did you get the sense that he thought the school wasn't doing what it should, or was your son just sort of out of the norm and he thought he would be better off with you and your husband, I suppose?
That's a great question. This principal knew me well. I had worked with him. He was part of my advisory committee for my fitness company that I was piloting this children's fitness program in the schools. And he knew my paradigm of thought as far as healthy children, unmedicated, let them be little boys, run around and do things, let them be, little kids. And I had that already in my frame of mind. And so he told me, he says, you know what, he's going to be one of those kids that's going to be pushed through the system, and they're just going to drug him and he's going to fall through the cracks. And here's a principal of a public school identifying exactly the paradigm that they operate in to this day, and it's even worse than that.
Okay. So Samantha, I want to ask you about your connection to homeschooling. I seem to recall that you were homeschooled, and share with our other people on the call and with our listeners what that experience was like.
My mom began homeschooling me when I was in first grade. My father was in the Air Force, so we were in Department of Defense schools. And while we were stationed overseas, my mom decided that the homeschooling opportunities that were available through like base connections are probably going to be a better fit for me than the Department of Defense schools that I was in at the time. And she was probably right about that at the time, that I was the kind of student that was going to get, easily bored. And at first, we were able to like really focus on inspiring my curiosity and exploring, interesting subjects that I wouldn't have had access to in school. So I would describe my elementary experience academically in positive terms. But when we came back stateside, my mom decided she wanted to continue homeschooling me. And the first church that we were in, that was not something that was a typical decision. The church had a school associated with it, and it was kind of seen as, it was kind of tutted as not supporting the church by not enrolling me in the church's school. So when we were again assigned to a different duty station in Florida, it became really important to my mom that we find a church that was very strongly in support of homeschooling and the homeschooling community. Unfortunately, my parents didn't have the kind of background to do the kind of research that Legislator Heidi is describing about learning and learning styles, learning methods. And as we progressed through the years, it became more and more difficult for them to meet my educational needs. And one of the struggles is that they might know something for themselves, but that didn't necessarily mean that they knew how to teach it to somebody else. And one of the other struggles that kind of started happening, especially as I started developing, hit like adolescence and puberty, was that it became difficult for my mom, because at some points you have to choose to be a parent and choose to be a teacher. And one of those things is going to suffer. Either your education isn't going, like something is going to have to give in there, or something about the parent-child relationship will maybe suffer. And that became kind of an issue. And the end result of it was that while they continued following the law that was required in Florida and filing the necessary paperwork, etc., my education functionally ceased in ninth grade. So I don't have more than an 8th grade education. I was accepted into a fundamentalist Christian college that was very friendly to homeschool students. So I was very fortunate that that existed and we had access to that. But I was excommunicated from my church for daring to be a woman that went to college. That very strong homeschool community ended up being a little bit toxic. And I had to spend the next 15 years fighting for just the basic education I should have received as a child.
We're going to come back, of course, in a few minutes and talk about whether the government has a role in regulating how homeschooling occurs, because I just want to share with our listeners and with our participants on the line here something that I read that you had written about your education. And I think this is just echoes what you were saying earlier, but you said my education was inadequate in the following ways. My parents didn't know how to teach me any form of basic math beyond basic arithmetic. And once I reached algebra in high school, I was forced to try to teach myself. I was unsuccessful, but attributed my inability to do that to being a woman, as I thought had been taught that women were innately incapable of understanding higher math. So that did I get that right?
That is accurate about my experience. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Nicole, I want to come to you next and talk about your own experience with homeschooling, and you are a homeschooling parent as well. So share with us your connection to homeschooling.
So I guess similar to Heidi, homeschooling was actually suggested to me by a teacher, Miss Masood. She suggested it to me, but when she suggested it to me, it was really just for a semester to help one of my sons kind of get in order, figure out some things with him because he's ADHD, has some executive functioning issues, and the school that he was in at the time, great school. I had a beautiful school experience. It's a magnet school for high achievers that is 90%, I'll say 90% of the Black boys score above average there. And so with this particular school, I just loved everything about them and how they had parents involved and all that. And so, but my son was struggling because the title of the school was Magnet School for High Achievers after the title. And so we got in because he tests well. And I know it's kind of weird. He will test well. But when he came down to the day-to-day work, he wasn't getting it. And so we love that school because it was only a school that was only from, I think, 3rd to 6th grade. After that, you had to go to middle school. And I'm gonna be honest with you, my kids went to a middle school, a local charter school, and it was a really horrible situation there as far as like the school goes. But I wouldn't say it was a horrible situation for the charter school because the charter school actually had 2 sides to it. It had a girl side and a boy side. And the boy side, I would go to the girl side and be like, oh my God, it smells like potpourri over here. And teachers are at the door hugging kids and all of these beautiful things. And they got extra clubs. And you literally turn at the front office and go to the boy side. And they had programs on juvenile justice, basically saying, don't go to jail. I was like, okay, this is not going to work for me. If I had a girl, would have been perfect. So I had a teacher who just suggested that I look into homeschooling because she wanted to homeschool her kids. I volunteered so much with the school that she was like, basically, honey, if you homeschool, can my child come with you? So I decided to do some research to make sure that I actually knew. And so the first book I found when I went to the library, it was called How I Homeschooled My African-American Boys to the Ivy League. And I was like, what? By Paula Penn Norbert. I never forget that. How I Homeschooled My African-American Boys to the Ivy League. I said, I want to see this. So I read through her whole book. And then I was like, well, maybe I can do this. We come to the conclusion that the way we homeschool is basically answer to the problems that we see in our community. And it's a form of resistance. For me, the homeschooling path of Black homeschooling parents is a form of resistance because we do deal with other people in our community saying, as hard fought as public education was for our group, there's nothing in reference to any rights that we have as a group that we did not have to fight hard to get legislated to pull away from the public school sphere. There have been people who feel like, hey, what are you doing? But we feel like in this space, this is our own form of resistance because like Bell Hooks says, the revolution starts at your kitchen table. And so I am here to start the revolution at my kitchen table for giving my children culturally relevant Black history and all the things that they need to be successful. And I believe that our children deserve the opportunity for a curated education. And so that's what we're doing.
Nicole, thanks so much for sharing that. I think it really adds to my understanding of the reasons people are motivated to want to do homeschooling, and your reasons are probably different from others. But in your case, it was as you say, a form of resistance. Your kids weren't getting what you felt they needed to get in school. So you and many other parents in your coalition, your group, decided you could do better by doing it away from school and as a community. Weston, let's come to you now and have you share your homeschooling experience.
Thank you. Yes. So I, like Samantha, grew up in a homeschool family. My parents' motivation was, well, we grew up in the suburbs of Dallas, and their motivation was largely religion. They were very strong in their Christian faith, and had learned along the way that schools were indoctrinating children and kind of making them agents of the government and teaching them false history, teaching things like the theory of evolution instead of creationism, some of those points that would directly challenge the faith that was important to my parents. So I grew up fully homeschooled. And at the time, it was interesting. I liked being with my mom. I enjoyed being at home. There were definitely aspects I can look back to with a positive light. For about 1 year, we joined a homeschool co-op. And so I did have a sort of mirrored experience to school. We met at a local church, and we had classrooms and would go from classroom to classroom. We'd follow this sort of class schedule and had a kind of typical school experience, if you could call it that. We did that for about 1 year, but ultimately my parents decided it was it just wasn't conservative enough for their taste. So as I look back, though, I do see a lot of gaps in the education. I was in my mid-20s learning basic financial literacy, Googling major events in US history, like dates for World War II, or even understanding what it meant to be a Democrat. My parents were very staunch in their Republican views, to the point that I didn't even understand what the other political party meant. Same thing, zooming out a little bit about international politics was not something that we ever discussed or that I was aware of. So I was moving into the 20s trying to learn these things. No other teaching on other views of Christianity, much less education on other forms of spirituality or approach to life. And while I still to this day believe my parents' intentions were pure and were to give us the best, to protect us, I reflect back and see a lot of areas where, and like a very interesting parallel and inverse to Nicole's experience, there was a lot of straight up, in my view, in my words now, white nationalism baked in. I learned things like the enslavement of millions of people was necessary for America's growth. I didn't know about any of the key leaders of the civil rights movement. And so my parents, I never thought that they were racist because there was no direct brutal attack on someone who looked different. But in every way, when they would show up to vote, and just the omission of, hey, these things make us uncomfortable, we're not going to talk about them. When they're real, they're part of our history, and they need to be talked about, was missing. In addition to that, it was a very homophobic view. That kind of comes from the religious part, but that was reflected in that's kind of central to all of it. Inherently was very sexist as well, because the religion and the education were so closely mirrored that if you, were a woman, perceived as, that there was just a significant disadvantage, and there was a very clear track for what your life would look like. So your only goal was to grow up, find a husband, start a family, care for that family, And they would make exceptions. Maybe you could do this. Maybe, it wasn't a super hard rule, but that was really the only path that was given. So there's a forced dependency created for all the women that I knew who grew up in that environment, because the only thing they were prepared for was the most basic educational skills, because they wouldn't need to worry about doing anything else. Their role would be in the home. So my siblings and everyone else I knew in this community, which was quite a few people, is a large network, knew how to make bread, knew how to sew clothes, but how to work in an office environment, how to pursue something in science was not an option that was afforded, unless that person was extremely driven and really clawed their way to find that information. It was not accessible in the way that it was to people like my cousins or friends that grew up in my neighborhood that I knew that were able to access those things.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think what we've now heard is a range of experiences each of you has had with homeschooling, and they're very different one to the next. And I now want to ask each of you to share your perspectives on this question that I brought up at the top of the show about the role that government at the state, local, or federal level should have when it comes to homeschooling, and whether there should be some sort of regulation in terms of what parents have to be able to show that they're doing, or whether, like in 9 states, the other states should really follow along and say, look, this is the purview of parents. They should be able to do what they want. It's their children. They have the right to educate their children the way they want. Government ought to stay out of their lives, out of their education. So let me just have each of you share your perspectives on those questions. And maybe I'll start with going back to you, Heidi, since we started with you on the first question.
This is a loaded question. And I have to say, Samantha and Weston, you still have a future ahead of you, and you still can make choices and make up the difference. You don't have to stay put in one place. And that's the beauty of, you still have a life to live, and you will learn. And as I say to all the kids that I've worked with through the years, it's like everything can be a good example, even if it's a good example of what not to do. And to move forward from that is a teachable moment. And my heart breaks for you for the difficulties that you recognized, once you stepped away and you started to see. And Nicole, I applaud you for getting your college degree. That's so awesome. That's so awesome. But, I say all the time, homeschooling is not for everybody. And, here in Maine, we have very, very, they're very favorable laws. They're not overregulated. There are some certain parameters. You need to submit a letter of intent. You need to agree. If you submit a letter of intent, which is not an application, this is just like if you post your properties, like don't trespass. I intend to homeschool. Well, if you do that, you are required to submit your choice of either assessments, testing at the end, or a portfolio that has to be seen by a certified Maine state teacher. And that has to be submitted to the state and to the local superintendent. You don't have to have tons of regulations. They have to follow to get the Maine state diploma. There are courses that need to be, that are required. I mean, you need to have, 4 years of an English, 3 years of math, well, 2 years actually, science, so there are criteria that the public school has to follow as well. I do not, as a policymaker, and I can see that legislators want to make laws. They want to regulate. They want to, have control over people. I think the history now, Samantha and Weston, you guys have shared very heart-wrenching stories. The overwhelming evidence nationally for homeschooling is the fact that there's an opportunity for students to excel. There has been great success in the homeschool movement. And, back in the late 70s and 80s when they were starting to do this and it was more underground, parents were terrified that they weren't going to do the right thing. So there was a real sense of urgency. When I started in the late 1980s into the 90s and 2000s, I was an anomaly in Maine to be homeschooling, and you were constantly looking over your shoulder because of those stories that somebody could come knocking at your door. And there were times that happened to people. And so to do your due diligence. And that's where I think like having a support group, that you have to become part of a support group, I think I thought that was a really good policy that was put in place that forced homeschoolers to connect with others, to learn, and to, it's almost like you're being somewhat accountable to. See, I think keeping it simple, keeping it favorable so that parents don't feel like they have to hide, I think the success rate has been there. The record has shown that this is effective. The more you regulate, the more you're going to have issues and problems. Now, if we can mitigate things like what Samantha and Weston dealt with, I think like a support group that has certain criteria that they need to follow if they're going to lead might be something to consider.
Samantha, I'll come to you and just have you respond to the same question that Heidi just responded to.
All right, so as my position as Government Relations Director at CRHE, it means I kind of have a bird's eye view of what regulation looks like across the country. And I wanted to correct the notion that only 9 states take this hands-off approach. It's actually 11 states that have no regulation whatsoever. Parents aren't asked to enroll their children in homeschool. There's nothing. We just want opportunities for homeschool students to have the same kinds of experience that the public school students get to enjoy. And then on the other hand, my parents now, because they've watched me and my sister have come to deeply regret the choices that they made when they were homeschooling us. Like, I have a great relationship with my parents now. They're very supportive, have always loved me. But now their perspective has shifted a good bit. And if they had the chance to do it over, things would be very different.
Nicole, your thoughts on the role of government when it comes to homeschooling?
I'm in support of more regulation on umbrella schools to do what they need to do and not bringing it to the doorstep of the parents. I feel like if any regulation is done, if you are accepting government funds, there absolutely has to be some assessment. How do we know if the money you're giving is actually working?
Weston, we want to come to you and have you share your thoughts on this question, which again, for our listeners, is about the role that you think government should play when it comes to homeschooling.
Yeah, I will echo what Heidi said. That is a loaded question, and it's one we could spend hours talking about, and many people have spent hours talking about it. In my view, and the shortest answer, I absolutely believe that there should be regulation, that there should be oversight. In my household, I grew up hearing the phrase rights of the parent over and over and over again. And it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that for the first time I heard, well, what about the rights of the child to a basic education? And it's a very complex, nuanced issue. So I want to speak only from my experience. But in my homeschool community, which represented dozens of children, it wasn't just me, and I have 8 younger siblings, so it wasn't just us. It was dozens and dozens of people in Dallas, Texas, that blatantly rejected kind of just science at large, or components of science that might not have aligned with our religious persuasion. So that looked like withholding of healthcare, rejection of basic vaccines, full rejection of mental health issues, so no understanding for mental health or support, as well as complete rejection for neurodivergency, unless someone expressed their neurodivergency in such an extremely clear way that you had to accept it. If someone kind of was able to fit in, there was no room for anything in between. So there's no testing like in my homeschool circles. Something simple like dyslexia, recognizing that could take years to be delayed, understanding ADHD and so on and so forth down the list. These things were just not talked about. So on the other end of that, the kid grows up feeling like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I keep up? Why don't I understand? Because that level of oversight isn't that opportunity to say, hey, there's nothing wrong with you. Your brain's just a little different. Here's how we're going to support you. We're not talking about homeschooling losing opportunities for high education and opportunities in STEM and something. We're talking about homeschoolers who cannot read and write. This isn't like well, you're 90% here, 95% here. We're talking about an incredible gap, not just for myself, not just for my 8 younger siblings, but for the dozens and dozens of other homeschoolers I knew. This was a near universal experience in my particular world. I mean, my high school diploma was printed from Google Images and signed, and there was absolutely complete hands-off, no input from the state in Texas at the time. My most succinct answer is I'm hugely in favor of oversight. I understand there's no super simple answer, but if I look back and there would have been someone who would have checked on me, someone who would have tried to make sure that I had access to the resources that other kids my age, my peers, had access to, it would have made a world of difference.
So in situations like this, where I think both Samantha and Weston described situations where they didn't receive portions of the curriculum that they later wished they had, and you, I'm sure there are other examples where parents are either incapable of teaching a subject that they don't know how to teach, or they don't have the time to do it, or they teach something that is directly contrary to what the state standards might say every child should know. Heidi, you expressed some empathy for what both of them went through and said these, wrenching stories. I think you said, you feel bad that they had to go through that. But is that just an unfortunate consequence of unregulated homeschooling that we have to live with? Or is there a role that government should have played in their states to prevent them from having those big gaps in their education?
Well, that's a really good question, and I know we're short on time, but I would just say, knowing what's happening in the public education system, there are ginormous gaps in education. They don't know how to read, they don't know math, they don't know science, they don't know history. All the things that Weston was listing, I'm thinking, this is exactly what's happening in the public education system. Now, does that justify the fact that this is happening in the homeschool community? There is no excuse. There is no excuse. And parents, like I said, homeschooling is not for everyone. And parents have to get engaged. What Nicole shared about the learning process that she learned along with her children, that is what needs to be encouraged. Parents need to be encouraged to do this. I'm a huge, and Weston, I'm with you. I am a huge advocate for the well-being of children, and the focus should be on children. It's not about, yes, the parents need to exercise that role, but they need to be coached in how to pay attention to their children and what is the need of their children, and look at down the road the future and don't limit their future. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Samantha, you talked about providing opportunities, and Heidi, you talked about support for these things. Nicole, you talked about some of the same things that government could provide in terms of giving parents a chance to be really effective teachers in home. But I just wonder about this question, which Heidi, you acknowledge is an important one or a good one, is what happens when some parents are unable or unwilling to take advantage of those things. And then you get stories like the one that Samantha and Weston told, where their education suffered tremendously. And that's not to say that public schools always do it better, but does government have a role to step in and, for the sake of children that you mentioned, Heidi, step in cases where Samantha and Weston were not getting an adequate education and do something about it?
You talk about, there are truancy laws, and when you're homeschooling, there should be a respect for the fact that the child is supposed to be learning something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where at the end of the year there's some sort of assessments. I think there should be assessments, or a certified teacher looking at what a child has done. And it's what the child has done, not what the parent tells them the child has done.
Mhm.
And have an opportunity to talk with the child. You find out what a child knows and what they don't know. And you see them get engaged or that they're completely checked out. So I think that is a really vital component to consider.
Thank you, Heidi. I just want you all to reflect on this very brief conversation about a very complicated set of questions. But Weston, let's start with you. What's your takeaway from this? What did you learn and what did you think about the way we had this conversation?
I love having this conversation. It's one that I could have over and over again, and I have, and it could go on for hours. It's very interesting. I really valued Heidi's point of it's about the child. And I think a lot of times when we have these conversations, there becomes kind of a gridlock and it becomes about the parent. And yet, as a parent, just think you have these beautiful children, you want to protect, you want to equip, but also it's tough. And so give them the best shot that you can in the world. And remember, I think my takeaway is remember to keep it not just my view, not just the parent's point of view, but what's going to give our kids the best shot at life.
Nicole, let me ask you your thoughts about what you learned today and what you got out of this and what you thought of the way we had the conversation about this controversial set of questions.
I think everybody is concerned about the welfare of children. I think that the lens is we want to be able to provide children what they need and what they desire in a loving way. And I definitely think for myself and Heidi, we are saying that also that the parent's ability to provide that should be protected. No child deserves to have opportunity taken from them, but I do want for any of these conversations to welcome to the table those who have a voice to say we have never seen a system in the United States function to appropriately treat Black, Brown, Indigenous, or poor, the poor, totally appropriately when it comes to these educational issues.
Samantha, how about your reflections on today's conversation?
I really appreciated the fact that it was a balance between two people who had homeschool experience and people who homeschooled their own children. And I really want to just really say thank you to Nicole for coming. Black, Brown, Hispanic homeschoolers was not as common as it is today. And that I'm really fortunate in my organization. We have Latina and Black people who had their own experiences, but it is different today. And it is really interesting watching the conversation that Black homeschoolers have with bell hooks, the revolution begins at the kitchen table, like those concepts and being able to have the curated education that you talked about. Like, I think it's really special what like groups like yours are doing. And I always love learning and hearing about everything that you guys get to do and explore.
Heidi, we'll come to you last and your reflections on our conversation today on this.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of takeaways. I mean, each one, I could sit down with each one of you and just listen and just explore ideas. Living in a rural part of Maine on a farm, and I'm thankful my dogs and all the animals are asleep. It's dark outside. It's a whole different world here in Maine than in, when I just got a slice of different parts of homeschooling. I think I have a pretty good feel of what's going on here in Maine. But to hear the different cultures, really, we're talking about different cultures, which is exciting. And how do we best serve all these different cultures in the United States to homeschool their children to the best of their ability and give those children every opportunity to shoot for the stars because they might hit the moon, and give them those resources and provide them. And that's where I just think mentoring and just, I don't think government is the idea to come in and fix that. That's going to have to be people, but you can put guardrails in policy that help to motivate people into the right direction. Just like, when you're bowling, you have those bumper guards. You keep them on the right path, heading in the right direction, and then encourage. And I think we could learn a lot from each other. And I've been really blessed to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. I so appreciated your acknowledging what I hope to have happen in these things is that people bring different experiences to these conversations, and you're mentioning the importance of listening to one another. And I just want to urge all of our listeners to take something away from this conversation. I think it's what I've come to value is the importance of listening and really trying to understand other perspectives rather than thinking our job is to convince every time we have a chance other people to think like we do. And so I want to urge all of you out there, when you have conversations around the holiday table or in state houses, Heidi, or in school board meetings, that we focus on trying to be curious and to try to show some empathy, try to understand one another, and just open the possibility that maybe we can learn something and understand something about other people, other cultures that we didn't understand before, and disagree better, sometimes find common ground, as I think we might have here. So with that, I just want to thank all of you, the four of you, for being part of this important conversation and for listening to one another and being curious and being respectful. So for those of you listening, you can find this episode at schoolconversations.org and on your favorite podcasting platform. You will also find some episode notes, including some links to websites and organizations related to today's topic on our website. So long, everyone.